Start increasing your influence and maximizing your potential with Ria's audiobooks. Available at audible.com, amazon.com, and iBooks. Please visit riastory.com to learn about Ria's books, resources, speaking, and training programs. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast episode on self-judgment. I wanted to do a podcast episode on this topic because I think that it's one issue that many of us struggle with. Many women, I think many women struggle with self-judgment or being our own worst critic. And I think at some point or another in our lives, we've probably judged ourselves far more harshly than other people would judge us, right? We criticize ourselves, our behaviors, our choices, our results far more than anyone else will. And I think we're probably, most of us are conscious of doing that. We beat ourselves up so much of the time. We kind of get into just that vicious cycle of self-defeating thoughts, choices, actions because we are criticizing ourselves, and then we start to internalize the belief of failure. And then we start to think, well, I made a mistake, so therefore I am the mistake. And then it just becomes a vicious cycle that we're not able to swirl out of. And then we turn to even more things in order to numb those feelings or emotions of failure or criticism or self-judgment. And then it just continues to spiral downward. So I think at some point most of us have at least some awareness of when we're beating ourselves up. But let's talk about number one, why do we have so much self-judgment to begin with? And how can we channel that or use that or minimize that if that's what's necessary so that we can turn that into from a negative thing where we're just beating ourselves up constantly to actually using some of that feedback constructively and helping us build something better. So, wanted to do a podcast episode on this. And a lot of times when I do podcasts on this kind of topic, this is something that as I think about it, I continue to think about it. And so I might have different thoughts in a year from now than I would today, but that's okay. That's part of growth. So one of the things I like to do is share with you what I'm thinking through and learning as I'm thinking through it. And absolutely, as my level of awareness continues to grow, I might have a different perspective a year from now, 5 years from now. I hope I continue to grow, right? That's a good thing. That's a good sign of growth. But the downside of it is anytime I do a topic like this and then I do grow and a year or 5 years down the road, I think about it differently or have a different perspective, then I go back and go, oh man, I could have said that so much better or more clearly or differently, right? And I'm throwing that out there because I'm using that as an example of I don't beat myself up for that. I just look at it for what it is and say that's a sign of growth. So, number one, first and foremost, when we feel that self-judgment coming on, I want to I want to challenge you to number one, think about that for you. Is that also a growth situation where you have grown since you had this incident or wrote this thing or said this thing or did this thing a year ago or 5 years or 10 years ago? And if so, then it's a sign of growth to see things differently. So don't beat yourself up for that. That's the number one thing when it comes to self-judgment. I want to challenge you right there and say, is this an opportunity of growth? And if it is, then I don't need to judge myself harshly for that. I simply just need to apply the lesson learned going forward. So, a kind of a different way to start looking at self-judgment is a lot of times we look back on things we said or did or choices, and we simply realize we've grown. It's kind of like when I write a book. The thing about writing a book or doing a podcast, you put it out there and then you do continue to grow, which is good. But then you go back and read that book a few years later and go, wow, how much I've grown since then. The growth is a positive thing, and seeing the growth is a positive thing. But it's easy to beat ourselves up over what we did in the past because of who we were in the past. And I want us to stop beating ourselves up for that. I want us to continue to use that growth and be aware of the growth, but let's use it in a constructive manner instead of being our own worst critic. So, to really dig into that, I think number one, why do we judge ourselves to begin with? And I think that this really comes down to our deep seated attachment to our identity. So I'll give you a couple examples that hopefully clarify that. Most of the time, we want to create an identity for ourselves, or we have created an identity for ourselves, and we become very attached to that identity. And when our thoughts or words or deeds, actions, choices, behaviors don't line up with that identity, then we judge ourselves for it because we're holding that sense of identity up as part of our inherent self-worth. So a couple of examples that I can think of and how this might look, what this might look like. For example, if you are a parent and you have kids, odds are good you want to be a good parent. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. And so perhaps you want to create part of your identity as a mom, or part of your identity in that parenting role as a mom, as a good mom, right? One who cares about her kids, one who provides for them. Maybe that identity for you looks like always cooking dinner. I know when Eric was obviously much, much, much younger, but I remember one of the things I thought that I was supposed to do was making sure that we had a cooked meal for dinner, particularly the nights that Eric was with us. And, that it might not have always been the healthy choice, but one of the things I thought I was supposed to do as, as part of my role was making sure that we had, macaroni and cheese and green beans and maybe chicken fingers or whatever. I don't even remember what I cooked back then, but it probably wasn't nearly as healthy as it as I might have thought it was, but, there again, a sign of growth, right? But I just remember that, that was just part of the way I thought what I should do in my role. And so what would frustrate me, here's the funny part, is that maybe the nights when Eric wasn't planned to be with us, and, he was supposed to be with, his grandparents or his mom, or somebody else, or maybe he was spending the night out, or something like that. But then we had a change of plans suddenly, and so he would be at our house unexpectedly as a last minute change of plans. And then I would go like, oh my goodness, I don't have anything to cook for dinner. And so I would feel like I'm failing at this parenting thing or step parenting thing, because part of my expectation for myself in that role and that part of my identity was having dinner prepared. And it would drive me crazy when there was a change of plans. This sounds so funny talking about it now, after so much growth has gone by, but it would, because I held myself to that standard when plans changed and I didn't have anything ready for dinner, I would feel like I had failed in that dimension of my role. And then I would start to feel like, well, if I failed, then then that defines me, right? That defines me as a parent or step parent, because I failed in this dimension of providing a hot cooked meal. And so from then it starts to become a self-judgment, right? Because I'm holding myself up to a standard. Probably nobody else even would have cared if we had frozen leftover pizza, or if I had actually cooked macaroni and cheese and green beans and, fried chicken or whatever. Probably nobody else would have, maybe they would have even preferred the frozen, leftover pizza. I don't know. But my point here is that I held myself to that standard. That's one of the things that I said, "Oh, this is what success looks like. This is what a good parent would do is have dinner cooked. And though when I failed in that for whatever reason, it was so easy to criticize myself for that and judge myself for that because I didn't hold myself to the highest standard of what I thought this role should look like. So that's one example of how that might show up. But here's another thought: it might show up in things like your weight or your physical appearance. And some of these deep seated beliefs about what we should do or what we should look like or how we should act are created at an early point in our lives. A lot of times little girls are growing up, they're told that they should be nice and sweet and polite and quiet. And so it kind of we tend to adopt that sometimes. Not all the time, certainly, but a lot of times we adopt that as we start to become a little bit older and more mature, and we think, "Oh, well, women should be meek and quiet and polite." And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being polite, but I'm saying we should challenge our perspective of how we should be showing up if it's not working for us. Now, absolutely, there are times, I mean, we should be polite. That's a good thing, but there are absolutely times when we need to stand up for ourselves, and being meek or quiet is not gonna serve us. I remember one time, I was working in an organization, and part of the, pay structure there was we got a monthly bonus as long as we didn't miss more than 8 hours of work for the whole month. So you could miss one day, but you couldn't miss more than one day. You couldn't miss 10 hours of work for the whole month. But as long as you missed 8 hours or less for the whole month, you were eligible for the monthly bonus. And basically, the bonus was a set amount if we reached a certain sales figure, and then the bonus would be split up among the employees that work there, the team members. Well, I remember one month in particular where we we worked really hard to hit a specific sales goal, and at the time, one of the employees went out on maternity leave, which meant there were only 2 of us there eligible for the bonus. And so that meant instead of splitting it 3 ways, we would be splitting it 2 ways. So the other person and I were or the other person and me were so excited. We were working really hard, and every day of the month we were making sure we were collecting receivables and getting all the accounts filed and all of that stuff, and we hit the actual target for the month. We hit it, and we knew we were going to get the top tier bonus, and it was going to be split 2 ways instead of 3. And so, man, this was cause for great rejoicing. Well, a couple days later we actually get our bonus check, and it wasn't what we thought it was going to be. And somehow we had the impression that the bonus would be split between the employees who were there, and the organization thought that the bonus would be split 3 ways regardless. Even if there weren't 3 people working, they would split it 3 ways and just pay 2 of us. I don't know. I still haven't figured that one out. But regardless, my point with all of that is that was a time when I stood up for myself and, just respectfully and politely, but still there was a time when I needed to have that confrontation and say, "Hey, according to the way I read the bonus structure payout, you owe me more money." And that can be a sticky situation, certainly. But I needed to have that confrontation. And again, in a polite, respectful way. But I didn't just need to be quiet and hope somebody else would figure it out, because they would never have figured it out. Right. So my point is, a lot of times how we think we should behave or what we should do, what success looks like in our role or our identity is shaped by early impact of environment, circumstances, other people around us, what they tell us we should do, how they tell us we should act. Sometimes it's how they define whether we're good or bad. If you've ever been told you're a good girl if you keep your clothes clean and don't mess your jeans up or your new shoes, or if you eat all your vegetables, and that's okay. Some of that's just normal as we go through life. But my point here is sometimes we start to identify in that way, and we get so attached to that belief or identity about ourselves that when we don't measure up, we become our own judge. We criticize ourselves because we didn't measure up. And so then our failure in that dimension start to make we internalize that instead of being having a failure, we become the failure. All right. And that's the essence of shame. And I think that's why so many of us are our own worst critic. That's why we are so harsh to judge ourselves, is because we're not really aware of, number one, how these beliefs got there to begin with. Number two, how a lot of times we measure our self worth on whether we are good enough, whether we did this good enough, whether we looked good enough, whether we weighed a certain number on the scale. And, I can remember growing up in my family, obviously, I had a pretty unhealthy family dynamic, but I can remember parents or grandparents even talking about weight as, you're good if you weigh a certain amount. If you weigh more than that, then, that's almost shameful because that's not what successful people do. That's not what healthy people do. And there's nothing wrong with being at a healthy weight, but when you start to obsess over the number over the scale as the measure of success, that's not healthy either. Because that's not focused on health, that's just focused on the number on the scale. So you see where I'm going with this. Then if you don't meet that number on the scale, it's so easy to beat yourself up, to judge yourself for that, and then you maybe fall into behaviors that help or make that worse. That's even possible too. You're like, "Oh, well, I'm never gonna weigh like I should weigh, and so now I'm just gonna eat a tub of ice cream because I'm clearly failing miserably at this dimension of my life, so I might as well just enjoy life," right? We throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So, thinking about that, I want you to just be conscious of where or how sometimes you're beating yourself up and what that's looking like, and then just examine why. Because the key to self-judgment isn't affirmations recited every day that claim the opposite. I mean, that's not a bad thing. Affirmations can be a good thing and be very positive, but the first step to overcoming self-judgment is awareness, right? I think that's one reason that physical exercise is so helpful in our growth, because so much of the time physical exercise focuses on just raising level of awareness. So, for example, if you're doing a type of mindfulness or meditation, dedicated prayer time, or if you're into yoga and stretching, you're focusing on awareness. If you're doing a particular stretch and you're holding that stretch, it's about just focusing on your breath and then notice where this feels tight. Does the left side or the right side feel different? Just be aware of how your body is showing up today. Being conscious of what your body needs. And maybe it's not yoga or stretching. Maybe it's running. So much of the time, if we're doing something like running or biking or walking, right? A lot of times we're going through the exercise, but also it raises our level of awareness. Well, how do I feel today? Kind of that check in with yourself when you're doing something physical, and it raises your level of awareness. I want you to just train your brain to start doing that emotionally, right? When you notice where you're beating yourself up or where you're judging yourself, the first step is just awareness. Well, number one, why do I feel like I have to have dinner cooked, uh, you know, a veggie and a carbohydrate and a protein on the table every night? And who told me it wasn't okay to just have pizza one night? Why do I have that inherent belief of this is, I'm a good person if I can do this, and I'm not a good person if I can't do that? So be aware of that. And being aware of it is going to allow you to kind of dig in and go, okay, well, number one, where is this coming from? Just be aware of it rather than criticizing yourself for it. I want you to just raise that level of awareness and go, oh, okay, this is why I have that belief. And I haven't really given it a whole lot of thought, but I imagine because my mom was not good at cooking or fixing meals. And so probably somewhere along the line of my early childhood, I thought, well, what I would love would be somebody who had a hot dinner prepared every night. And um probably somewhere along the line, I created that belief of this is what This was what mothers do is they would have, hot dinners every night on the table. And somewhere along the line, I just internalized that if that's what good parents do, then if I want to be a good parent, that's what I should do, right? And there again, you choose your value system and there's nothing wrong with that. You should choose it. But I want you to be aware of and intentionally choosing it rather than simply going along with whatever beliefs or limitations or identities you've adopted along the way for whatever reason, and you're not even sure why you're doing it. But then you criticize and beat yourself up when you don't measure up. This used to show up in well, it probably does still show up in so many ways, but I was more aware of it in a physical dimension, probably 10 years ago, where, you'd get on the scale and go, "Oh, I need to lose some weight." And so you're like, "Oh, I'll just eat protein bars for lunch and dinner, and then I'll have a salad for one meal of the day." And, you'd be starving by mid-morning and you'd fail miserably to just eat protein bars for the day, and you'd end up with a cheeseburger and fries and Oreo cookies. And then start to beat yourself up because you didn't number 1, you didn't do what you said you were gonna do, so you're destroying integrity with yourself, but also because you're like, "Well, gosh, if self-worth is tied to losing weight and I'm not losing weight, then what does that say about self-worth?" Right? So maybe this doesn't show up for you in physical ways or parenting roles, or maybe it's a career goal. Maybe not. Maybe self-judgment is not an issue you struggle with. In this case, this podcast is not probably not particularly relevant for you, but I think most women struggle with self-judgment in one form or another because we create some sort of our identity around our different roles in life. And again, that's natural, that's normal. But a lot of times with that is our attachment of our self-worth to that identity. Right? You've heard of the cliche of the business executive who's so wrapped up in work and so successful, and then they retire and they're, come down with a deadly disease and they pass away within 3 months of retiring because their whole sense of identity was wrapped up in that job. And if they didn't have that, then you took that away and they had nothing left in life, and they just kind of quit, or they got sick, or gave up, or became depressed. Maybe you are, a large part of your self-worth and identity is wrapped up in being a parent, and then your kids grow up and go to college and you have an empty nest, and suddenly you don't know where life is centered on because your center was wrapped up in that parenting role. And we all do that to some extent or another. Again, that's normal to have our sense of identity in our different roles, but we need to be careful and conscious of attaching our sense of self-worth to the dimensions of our identity, because that's where we start to judge. That's where we start to criticize ourselves. This could also show up in different ways, like religious beliefs or um, eating patterns, or we can create an unhealthy attachment to just about anything, and we could take that way too far in just about any direction if we're not careful of just being, just again, just noticing where is this showing up and how is it showing up in a healthy or unhealthy way. And self-judgment or self-criticism is unhealthy because we're not learning from the mistake. We're just beating ourselves up for having made it. And as long as we just spend all our time beating ourselves up for having made a mistake, then we're not going to take the lesson and learn it and then apply it going forward. We're just going to spend all our time and energy beating ourselves up for it. And it's easy to do, right? That's the victim mindset. I'm allowing something or something else and I'm blaming that for the circumstances or the result. And that's going to hold us back in life. We have to be conscious of that, and we can be our own victim, right? So we do have to be conscious of that, whether we're playing the victim to someone or something else or even ourselves. We have to be mindful of that, avoiding that victim mindset and saying, "You know what? I can't change the past. A regret, a mistake, or a decision made, or something that didn't serve me. But here's what I can do. I can change today. I cannot change the past. Cannot do anything about the past. But I have 100% control over doing something different today and tomorrow." And that's where the power comes in of raising that level of awareness and saying, "You know what? Rather than self-judge and self-criticize, I'm just going to focus on what I can fix, what I can take this lesson and apply it going forward, because that's the power of intentional choice. Until next time.